Hey guys, another morning video. Just kind of got up and got some work done, got some editing done. Checked out Overwatch University and there's a cool little post by Ebola Bailey called the best and worst matchup for every tank in Overwatch 2 complete tank matchup guide. I'll link this this post in the description. It was a really cool idea. I wanted to actually check out the post live, give my thoughts on it. It's not exactly going to be a hammer time, but it's going to be more of I'm going to use this idea as a springboard to put some of my own ideas as well. He's got a nice looks like a YouTube video as well.
In this video, I'm going to...
Yeah, so give this guy a check out. It looks like some good stuff here. But I want to give my thoughts on this as well. So starting with Doomfist, opinion is against Winston. Well, both heroes like to the backline. Yeah, so I actually like the Doomfist versus Winston matchup. You see, whenever we're looking at tank matchups, we have to look at two things. Number one, you have to look at the 1v1 matchup. So exactly how does the hero do in the 1 versus 1 and strictly the 1 versus 1. And then it comes to the play style. So the play style is essentially how does the hero play and complement the other hero's play style. So the reason why these differentiations need to exist, or this sort of the differences between the two need to exist is the classic one is Zara versus Diva, right? So Zara beats Diva in a 1v1 strictly most of the time. Like, it's just pretty straightforward if there's any sort of healing involved. However, Zara doesn't always really counter Diva in terms of the playstyle because if Diva is playing correctly in terms of using high grounds and off angles, usually the Zara is not going to be able to reach her or access her, and her bubbles lose a lot of value versus the Diva when she's playing like that. So it's actually not just simply, oh, it's the 1v1, it's a lot of times the playstyle itself. And in a way, I think Doomfist definitely can win the 1v1, but I also think that in a way Doomfist can do pretty good even just by countering the playstyle, because a lot of what Winston wants to do is he wants to commit with bubble. You can displace him with bubble. You can displace him before bubble to force his bubble. So I do think that Doomfist is probably his best matchup is versus Winston. I don't see any other hero here as being a favorable matchup. So I think it's going to be more about displacing the Winston and punching him around, as well as he's just got a big fat head that you could shoot in front, and he's the only tank that I think has relatively low damage at close range, at least in relation to the rest of the tank line. Like, obviously Wrecking Ball a little bit lower damage, but is a lot harder to punish. As Doomfist, you can definitely punch him out of slam, you can punch him out of grapple, which is probably the best thing that you can do. But in a 1v1, Junker Queen's got a better gun than you in close range, Arisa's got a better gun, Ramartra's going to be doing better damage to your face, Reinhardt's going to swing in your face, Diva's going to blow you up, Roadhog's going to blow you up, even Sigma's going to blow you up. He's got the rock as well. Zara's going to melt you. Wrecking Ball and Winston are the only two like relatively low DPS heroes, and those are also the heroes that Doomfist coincidentally does pretty well versus. And I think Winston's the more fragile of the bunch because he's more punished by that shotgun stuff. Wrecking Ball could just go in ball form. So in terms of the worst matchup for Doomfist, so I don't think it's Diva, because Diva can take pretty much has a hard time keeping up with Doomfist's tempo, even with low boosters, so she's not quite mobile enough to mark or peel Doomfist consistently, although she can destroy him in the 1v1. Junker Queen can't always reach where Doomfist stages, and the same thing goes for Ramartra. Reinhardt, Doomfist can pretty much avoid. Roadhog is a pretty bad matchup, but since the damage nerf, it's not as bad as it was in the past. Sigma, again, you can avoid him pretty much. It's really just rock that you have to worry about. Zara, again, does okay for bubble peeling and pressure, but again, she can be pretty much avoided. I agree. I think I agree with his assessment here, which is the Arisa, who's able to stay with her team and protect them from this dive. So I don't think it's so much as staying with her team, so much as that she's just able to put out consistent range pressure on the Doomfist, and Javelin is such like a death sentence. I will say this, if you guys don't know, that the Javelin itself does feed Doom block. So if you hit the Doom with the Javelin while he's blocking, the damage of the Javelin will go to the Doomfist block. So you need to be very careful that you can cancel the block, but you could also actually feed the block at the same time, even though the stun doesn't cancel the damage that it does. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Yeah, I mean, I think Arisa is right now probably the best counter, but I think you could make a good argument that if this hero, for example, was stronger, that he would probably can still be the best counter, just because he wins the 1v1, he can counter the playstyle, he can set up on angles where your Doomfist is trying to stage from. I don't even think it's necessary that Arisa can play on off angles or play with her team. I actually think it's more along the lines that just Arisa has better range damage. And has a Javelin, that consistent CC that just makes it really, really hard. It's very, actually these two heroes are very similar. The only difference for me versus Doomfist is that this hero feels a little stronger more of the time than this hero. So Okay, let's keep going. Diva has the best matchup, is also versus Winston. Diva is the ultimate peel tank, which means that Winston trying to dive her back and she was to disrupt and put the Winston in trouble. So I actually think it's not so much about the peel here. So Diva is really quite good at peeling, but a lot of Overwatch 2 is more about marking. And marking is essentially, as a dive hero tries to flank to set up on your backline, or tries to walk forward to set up a dive on your backline, you just basically 1v1 them. You walk in front of them before they even dive and start to shoot them in the face. So a Diva marking a Winston is a Winston taking a high ground. The Diva goes and flies at the high ground and then starts to shoot the Winston in the face before he even dives. And you just basically can force bubble, you can force some of his HP, you can force an early jump, you can force him to back off. That messes up his dive. Marking is just simply, you're trying to take an angle or a flank or high ground, and I'm just going to sit right on top of you and prevent you from doing what you want to do. And Diva's really, really good at that, because even though Diva is not, let's say, very good at 1v1ing a Zara, or not very good at 1v1ing a Rampart, not very good at 1v1ing a Sigma, right? Diva is very good at 1v1ing a Doomfist or a Winston, or even sometimes to an extent a Wrecking Ball. So if those heroes can't avoid her, and Winston isn't good at avoiding her because her mobility is even lower cooldown than his is, then it's very easy for you to not necessarily peel the Winston, because once he's already jumped, he's already done what he wants to do. But as he's setting up, you're already dumping damage in front of his face. And if he uses his bubble, now he can't jump, because any jump without bubble is a gamble. So I was working with Boger a couple of weeks ago, and he considers Diva actually to be even more of a Winston counter than Reaper or Bastion for this very same reason, because you can always go where the Winston is and shoot him in the face, and shoot him in the face, and shoot him in the face, and shoot him in the face. And as long as he doesn't have like a Zenyatta or a Widowmaker in the backline melting you, then there's just really nothing that can really stop you, because you do so much more damage than he does in close range. So again, it's not about the peel, because if he's already dove, yes, you can peel and blow up his bubble, but it's actually, he's already kind of done his job. You want to stop him before he even gets to that point. Okay, the worst matchup comes from Zara. Explanation is pretty simple. Zara is always able to beam through Diva's matrix. Trying to think here. So obviously the worst 1v1 matchup is that as a siren goes flying past. I think it's a fair assessment. I think it's more map dependent than anything else. I think a Doomfist can actually be a real nuisance, because he's actually one of the few dive tanks where it can feel really hard to keep up with his tempo. He can avoid you, but also I don't think it's a bad matchup at all, because if you do get in the 1v1, he can toast you. Yeah, I think if there is a counter for Diva, it would be Zarya. But Diva doesn't feel like she has a lot of counters, so much as a lot of situations where she's just not necessarily optimal. She never feels really bad, but she never really feels very good. Junker Queen, her favorite matchup is also Winston. He's not having a great time at the start of this list. Junker Queen, I mean, Winston just has a horrible tank matchup in general, right? Junker Queen's primary fire is also Shotgun Mechanic, which works super well against Winston's ledge hitbox. Winston will try to dive the Junker Queen. She has two counters to prevent this. The first is that her team usually play closer, so she can use it to try and disrupt the Winston. Second, her commanding shot is over 50 health. I mean, a lot of it for me as Winston is just that Junker Queen has a pretty good mid to close range damage, and that if you can match the Winston, then you're going to be good to go. I'm trying to think, is there anybody that Junker Queen would prefer to play more into? No, I think that's pretty fair. I think Winston is probably your best bet. I think the main reason why, does he talk about it here? So the main reason why Winston does she does so well versus Winston is there's two reasons why. One is her shotgun, right? It's actually not the shout, because unfortunately shout, if you're playing Junker Queen, sometimes you're not going to be stacked on top of your team, so your team might not entirely get the shout. It's the shotgun that, like Diva, helps you to mark or put a little bit of early pressure on Winston, and it's actually the knife. The knife is a huge one, because if you get the knife onto your Winston, as soon as bubble breaks, if you knife the Winston, about 1 second left on his jump, okay, that's probably not the best color to use. As he's jumping out, you can pull him back. It's very similar to the tech we use with the Wrecking Ball, where they slam, you knife them, they try to roll away, and you pull them back in. Same kind of thing as Winston, you kind of cut off his escape route. This is actually a big thing when teams in Overwatch League, when Junker Queen first came out, because we had just come off of a Winston meta with double flex support, and so a lot of teams still wanted to play Winston. APAC wanted to play Winston, these Asian regions, NA regions as well, and we just couldn't make it work because of the knife just as much as the shout. So Junker Queen, very good versus Winston for that matter. I think also pretty good versus Wrecking Ball for that matter. And in terms of the worst matchup for Junker Queen, what do we say here? Arisa, who's insane survivability up close. Yeah, I think that's fair. I think it's definitely not a favorable matchup. I would actually go as far to say that there's another unfavorable matchup as well. I'll give you guys a few seconds to think about it. But if Junker Queen doesn't do very well up close versus a person, she doesn't do very well in general. And there's another hero she doesn't do very well up close versus, and that's also Reinhardt. So I'd say Arisa and Reinhardt are kind of two peas in a pod right here. Reinhardt, you can put out a little bit of shield pressure early, similar to Arisa, where you can shoot her a little bit easier with your knife, maybe force some cooldowns, maybe force a javelin spin, maybe burn some shield. But ultimately, if these two heroes are able to close the distance on you, you're just pretty much cooked. Even with Carnage, even with knife, if that Reinhardt has any heal support whatsoever, or worst case scenario, if he hits a charge on you, you're just gonna die. You're just gonna die. And generally, Junker Queen won't be able to break shield fast enough to prevent the Reinhardt from just walking on top of her. So I had a really hard time when I was playing Junker Queen in Diamond and Low Masters, trying to play around Reinhardt comps. You almost had to play like a little bit, not flanky, but you had to try and find ways to bypass the Reinhardt shield if you couldn't spam it enough early and often. So Arisa is definitely not a good matchup, but I think Reinhardt deserves a shout as well. Arisa, speaking of Arisa, let's talk about her matchups next. She's definitely best. Her best one is definitely against Reinhardt. I do not agree with this at all. Arisa is able to kidnap the Reinhardt, almost entirely nullify him. No, I disagree here. I think you have a lot of I think this is a noob stomper matchup. If the Reinhardt isn't very good or isn't able to play cover or isn't able to force cooldowns, then yeah, you're going to have a hard time. But the thing is with the Reinhardt is if Reinhardt gets any heal support and he's able to close the distance within Arisa, after a few swings, you're going to be able to force a fortify, and then the Reinhardt has the tools to disengage and survive, and then the Arisa can no longer win the matchup without fortify. Arisa takes a really, really, really long time to kill a Reinhardt, which means that Reinhardt can generally just force your fortify and win after that. I don't agree with this at all. I think if anything, it's maybe a neutral matchup. I mean, you could javelin the Reinhardt back, you can javelin him out of pin, you can definitely javelin his shatter, but these are all like sort of niche things that a good Reinhardt will never happen to a good Reinhardt. Yeah, I don't agree with this much at all. I'll say one nice thing is that you can use your Terra Surge, her ultimate, through Reinhardt Shield, which is one big buff. But I actually think there's a lot of tanks that I'd rather play into as an Arisa rather than Reinhardt. Junker Queen is the one that we just talked about, right? I think I'd rather play into a Junker Queen as Arisa. I actually think Ramatra isn't the worst matchup in the world. I think I'd rather play up against a Ramatra than I would against a Reinhardt, especially in some maps. Doomfist depends on the map. If it's a very mobile map, I don't want to play versus Doomfist, but if it's a very narrow map, love playing versus Doomfist. Roadhog is, I eat this guy for lunch. Roadhog might be the best matchup, period, because I can destroy this guy in a 1v1. I can javelin him every time he tries to take an angle. He doesn't do any damage to me. My Fortify negates him. My Javelin Spin negates him. And even to an extent, a hero like a Winston or a Wrecking Ball. I think I'd rather play a Winston or a Wrecking Ball than I would versus a Reinhardt. Depending on the map, of course, but if it's a relatively narrow map, not a lot of high ground, not that bad. But I don't agree with this one at all. And then the worst matchup is Zara. I definitely agree with this one. Zara is pretty much always dependent on bubble charge being high. She has more energy than DPS. One way she's able to change this to Arisa is by blowing her ultimate. Arisa doesn't really have any defense against Zarya's beam attack. And to me, that's just it. Whenever we're considering heroes, it's about like, how do they do in the 1v1? Well, you just don't have any way of dealing with Zarya Beam's attack. And the irony here is that everybody's obsessed with Diva versus Zarya, which is fair. But the irony here is that I think Arisa's in some ways even a little bit worse than Diva in the 1v1, because unlike Diva, Arisa doesn't have the mobility to avoid Zarya. You often play at about the same ranges in similar positions. So how do you avoid Zarya Beam, right? What I found when I was playing Arisa into Zarya is I would generally have to try and force a bubble, play at a distance where she couldn't quite beam me and I could try and force a bubble out. But then if the Zarya was really disciplined and play cover, sometimes I just had to try and avoid her, which again, with a hero without a lot of mobility is really, really, really hard. The only time obviously Zarya should be scared of Arisa is if she has Fortify and if I don't have bubbles, but I don't like this matchup as Arisa at all. So I agree with that one. Ramatra, let's talk a little about Ramatra's matchup next. He's relatively new. His matchup is so fine. My newest best matchup is actually Sigma. Since Ram has two different ways of closing him down. Sigma's poking phase. He can close space. Yeah, so I actually think this one is really interesting. I don't feel that Ramatra has like a tank that he really hard counters. I think he can do fairly decent versus some tanks. I think he does fairly decent versus Junker Queen in some situations, but I also think he can do poorly. I do think that there are situations where he can do okay versus Reinhardt. In some situations, you can whittle him down more with your gun, with his shield, a little bit better than Arisa can, and then actually brawl him through shield better than Arisa can. So I like Ramatra versus Reinhardt. It's okay on some situations, but I agree. I think Ramatra isn't the best tank versus tank hero in the game, but if I were to take a tank 1v1, it would be versus Sigma, where I can absorb some of his damage while in my Omnic form, burn some of his shield, maybe force some of his cooldowns down, and as long as he doesn't have rock, or even if he does have rock, if I can close the distance and use Nemesis for him, I'm gonna win that tank trade. And a lot of the ways that Ramatra and Sigma operate are in similar circumstances. So I think Ramatra doesn't have a lot of great tank traits, but I think Sigma's probably his best. His worst, Roadhog. It was all about using your two forms of control positioning. Hog really ruins that with his hook ability. He can hook Ram out of position, and Ram doesn't really have a way of threatening hook. Let me think here. Yeah, I can see Roadhog. Now, Roadhog is really weak right now. So, in other words, if I'm playing Ramatra and I see a Roadhog, I'm not scared just because Roadhog is weak. But in theory, if Roadhog was better balanced, which we don't want, but if Roadhog was power, spike was as high as the rest of these other tanks, then yeah, I might be a little bit concerned about that. Worst matchup besides Roadhog for me? Maybe Wrecking Ball. You could definitely grapple him out, or you can use your E, your little suction vortex, to prevent him from slamming. You can also prevent that from grappling away and slow him down. But I will say that as Ramatra, you are a little bit slow and you don't have consistent range threat and you don't have any real hard CC. So Wrecking Ball can kind of just play to avoid you, more so than even like a Winston can, and it could be kind of like you're spectating while he's just abusing your backline. Now, you can do the same to his backline, which is why I don't say it is as much of a counter, but it is something that it doesn't give you flexibility with what you want to do. You really have to just ignore the Wrecking Ball because you just do no damage to him and try and trade backlines, which in some maps is easier said than done. So, yeah, I can agree with this one, but I think Wrecking Ball deserves a shot in some situations. Reinhardt. Next up is Reinhardt, whose best matchup comes against Zarya. Ryan is a damage kit as well as range. Yeah, I think a lot of it's just that it's a lot like why Arisa doesn't like Zara. It's like why Reinhardt doesn't like Zarya, or why Zarya doesn't like Reinhardt, because both want to fight in close ranges ish, but Reinhardt just beats the crap out of Zarya in close. Is there anything that Zarya really want to play versus? I think Zarya is again a situation where, like similar to Ramatra, a Winston on some maps can actually do pretty good versus Zarya because he can force your bubbles at range, but will play in a location where you don't do a lot of beam damage. So if Zarya's not beaming people, she's not going to feel very good. If you're only playing Zarya to bubble off your backline's dives and aren't really getting a lot of ult charge, aren't getting a lot of value, then you're going to have a hard time getting value with Zarya. You need to be trying to find ways to consistently beam, and that's where dive tanks like our friends right here have a really, really, really nice time. Can you guys imagine playing Zarya on Watchpoint Gibraltar versus a Winston Wrecking Ball just going all over the map? Now, that's an extreme example, but that kind of gives you my thoughts on this. In terms of the direct 1v1, Reinhardt was very, very favorable, but I think these heroes are also quite good. Reinhardt's best matchup versus Zarya. Okay, yeah. I don't think there's anything else that Reinhardt would crush. I do want to mention that Junker Queen is a pretty good matchup as well for Reinhardt. And depending on the matchup, Sigma is as well. But again, that's more of a map-specific pick, so it's something to keep in mind. Ryan's worship matchup is one of Zarya's best. Arisa, again, I just do not agree with this one at all. And I mentioned my reasons earlier. Reinhardt's worst matchup for me is probably... Again, if we ignore the strength of the hero right now, it might actually be a really good Doomfist can be really quite difficult. You can counterpin the Doomfist, but Reinhardt does have a little more mobility than he used to have, so he can deal a little bit with things like Winston, and he can deal a little bit with things like Wrecking Ball in terms of trading backlines and things like that. I don't know. Reinhardt doesn't love mobile things, so I might actually say... maybe Wrecking Ball or Doomfist, because again, those are two tanks that are super mobile that he cannot help his team versus. So he has to focus on trading backline, but that's a little bit easier said than done. You can't exactly go and swing on a Doomfist or Wrecking Ball most of the time. Now you can pin these targets. So if you get lucky and pin one of these targets, then that's very helpful. You can also do things like pin through mines as they're casting and break them. You can shatter either of these targets and they're very killable. But I remember back in Overwatch League when we would play versus good Doomfists, and it felt really tough, where it just felt like my Reinhardt was just watching his team die unless he stood with his backline, and if you stand with your backline, you're giving up too much space. So I think Arisa is definitely not the worst matchup. I think Doomfist maybe is the worst matchup, maybe Wrecking Ball. I will say that when Winston gets Primal, that's pretty tough as well, because you can't help a lot with that. But definitely more map specific. See, that's a tough thing, guys, is a lot of these just feel really meta and map specific, whereas like Roadhog's just trash right now. But if Roadhog's even close to being strong, then Doomfist hates it, right? Reinhardt's pretty darn strong right now. But if, like, let's say Ramatra was super overtuned as before, then there'd be no reason to pick Reinhardt and just pick Ramatra. But Reinhardt is still pretty good versus Ramatra in the 1v1, so it's a lot of factors. So a lot of this is just opinion and just the way of looking at it, and not necessarily fact at all. Roadhog is the ultimate counter. His absolute best matchup is Winston. Completely stop Winston dives. I don't know. I like, if I'm playing Roadhog, I still think like something like a Doomfist would be a little bit easier for me, just because of how easy that hook is without bubble. Although I will say your ultimate does really good versus Winston. Primal Rage, even without Primal Rage, just a normal dive when you have Whole Hog is like pretty easy to shut down. So I think Winston's a fair one. Yeah, Arisa, 100% agree with Arisa. I mean, you just cancel everything that he does, and she beats your playstyle. She beats you in the 1v1. There's just nothing you can do. Sigma's best matchup is Roadhog. I would agree with that as well. You both kind of playing at medium to long range, kind of like the Zara versus Arisa again, but this guy beats this guy because this guy has shields and easy to hit shots, and his shift and his rock deals with you well. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, is there anything that would beat Roadhog harder? Or anything that Sigma rather would prefer to play versus, I'm getting my stuff confused here. No, I think that's fair. I think that's fair. Worst matchup for Sigma is Ramatra. That's fair. We talked about that matchup already. Winston, best matchup is Sigma. I would agree with that. Again, more map specific, but I think the fact that Winston can beat Sigma in a 1v1 sometimes is like huge. He's like the only tank that you can beat in a 1v1. I think in terms of play style, I think Winston does fairly well versus Zara by being able to avoid her and force both of her bubbles, but then playing in a way to where she can't reach. Whereas Winston versus the Reinhardt can't exactly reach, but he does at least have pen. So that's something that can help out a lot. So I think Winston versus Zarya, Winston versus Sigma are pretty good matchups most of the time. Worst matchup is Roadhog. We talked about that a little bit already. Wrecking Ball, best matchup is against Reinhardt. I mean, I think probably Wrecking Ball is going to be doing better, probably a little better versus Ramatra. But yeah, I think either one of these targets is fairly decent, just because, again, you can kind of avoid them entirely because they're not the most mobile. And you know, I actually think that you're not even that bad versus Zarya, because she can definitely use her bubbles to peel you off. But again, it's easy to avoid her. Now, she will peel you off, but she actually does surprisingly low damage to you with your armor and your damage reduction, unless she's super high charge. Okay. Worst matchup is Roadhog. Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's definitely not a favorable matchup compared to a lot of the other tanks. Wrecking Ball can kind of avoid most of the tank casts, but Roadhog is a little bit more difficult. Zarya, strongest matchup comes against Diva. I actually think her strongest matchup goes against Arisa. I think there's lots of ways for Diva to play to avoid Zarya entirely, to negate the 1v1 matchup. I think as an Arisa, it's a lot harder to play into a Zarya than it is for a Diva. And then worst matchup comes against Reinhardt. Yes and no. Zara and Winston, I think, is Reinhardt or Winston, I would say, or the worst matchups, depending on the situation, depending on the map. Zara has the best tank matchups overall. Fair enough. I think this is a lot more contextual, but yeah, great video. I really respect this video and this little great video and great little write up, I guess, from Ebola Bailey. So really cool little thing. Check this one out. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Obviously, like I said, a lot of this is going to be contextual on meta and stuff. So, but it was just an interesting concept, and I figured I'd give my 2 cents. So have a good afternoon and evening and morning and so on, guys.